victory is the elimination of Zelensky and this crowd of criminals in Kyiv. That's it. They've got to go away, and they're not going to get into their planes and try to fly to Miami to their new residence or to Israel or somewhere else. So you're going to have to go in there and get them. And I don't think it's beyond the means of the Russian military at all. I think they're really in a very strong position. They can do pretty much what they want, but they have to make up their minds, because without that, there can be no genuine victory, if you will. Victory is an end state. That means the enemy stops fighting. Ultimately, if you're a Russian, there's no more fighting going on. It ends.
Yeah.
How do you get there? You got to get rid of the Zelensky regime.
Yeah. And I mean, just militarily, even if you take the emotions out of it, I mean, you can't have the guy who's this detached from reality still in office when this comes to it. There's no reason why anybody in Russia would ever agree to a negotiated settlement. And they are still interested in a negotiated settlement, interestingly. Let me get to that in a second. But there's one more thing about Zelensky I want to talk about, because if Raditz didn't ask any follow-up questions of Zelensky, she did give him a chance to again challenge Trump.
With all due respect to President Trump, Zelensky says, I think it's just his personal opinion. Trust me, we understand the Russians much better, the mentality of the Russians, than the Americans understand the Russians. I know for sure Putin doesn't want to stop the war.
We'll get to his question in just a second, but this is the latest of many times where Zelensky, even going back before that famous explosion in the Oval Office in February, where he directly challenges Trump and says, yeah, he doesn't understand. He's a Putin stooge. He said that before. He's a subject of misinformation by the Russian side. And now he just doesn't understand. We understand, meaning Trump should just forget about what he says and do what Zelensky says. And I just got to ask, Trump prides himself on being this strong type A alpha male kind of person, but why does he keep allowing Zelensky to do this?
Well, I think there are a lot of people that claim to be alpha males or want to be alpha males, but there aren't really that many alpha males out there. Let's be frank. So I don't know about that. I think a good example of this whole thing is your fellow Texan McCall, who recently went into a meeting and came out of it and said, we've got to fight this war to the finish against these evil Russians for all intents and purposes and send more money to Ukraine. I mean, good Lord. What is he talking about? Again, you've got to look at his bank account. Who's filling it up? When you look at Martha Raddatz, who works for her? Who does she work for? Who pays her? That's all it's about. Everybody in the sort of Washington media community is all on the payroll for somebody. Nobody's out there telling the truth unless somebody's paying them to say it. And what you and I call the truth and what they say is the truth are entirely distinct and unrelated. So at this point, I don't think we should be surprised by any of it. This is going to go on, as I said, until the Russians end it. They have the power to end this thing once and for all. Now, there's something else I wanted to mention. It was pointed out to me by someone who's a much more astute observer of these things than I am. When Lindsey Graham and this man, Richard Blumenthal, the former Marine reservist who claimed he'd been in Vietnam and never was near it, and the combat lawyer, the two of them were standing in front of a picture or a painting, and it showed the caves beneath the monastery and cathedral in Kyiv. These caves have a specific name and a specific meaning in Christian Orthodox theology and in Russian national history. And by positioning these two people that want this war to go on until Russia is destroyed, they were in front of this, and the message, the subliminal message with this painting was, we will destroy this if we have to, but we won't give up. And I think that's probably why Zelensky put them in front of it. Remember, they've gone to great lengths to suppress the Orthodox Christian Church of Russia inside Ukraine and treated everybody associated with it as a traitor and an enemy and so forth. So putting them there meant nothing to us in the West. I didn't pick up on it, obviously. But anybody who knows the history of the region and Kiev and Orthodox Christianity saw this. There was a very clear message. We will all destroy everything that is here before we give up. And that's why I think President Putin has to face the reality that he's got to intervene and smash these people once and for all. And I understand his reticence to do so. He wants to avoid this. And I understand that he's still concerned about potential U.S. intervention. I don't see it at this point. I really don't. But we can talk about why I don't really fear that at this point in other settings.
And you know, the disagreement or the lack or the unwillingness to move into reality among NATO is I just still is puzzling to me. Here is Mark Rutte talking about how just ignoring all of the combat realities that you've written about in so many books about how national combat power is made and doing a balance of power assessment between two combatant forces, etc. Ignoring all that and still says stuff like this.
We are facing the most dangerous security environment in decades. Russia's war of aggression continues. Terrorist threats persist. We are not at war, but we are not at peace either. So we must continue to strengthen our deterrence and defense. And that means pivoting towards a full warfighting readiness.
You know, I mean, you can want to do that, but I mean, if you just look at the defense industrial base alone, you said, I think last time you were on our show, you said it would be probably 10 years of sustained effort to even start to make a measurable difference. And they're talking about in 4 years. So what accounts for this lack of understanding or unwillingness to acknowledge it?
A combination of ignorance and I suppose you have to add to it unreasonable and inaccurate self-assessment. One of the things that we don't do well, and this is something the Russians do very well, by the way, Dan, but we don't self-assess. We don't look at ourselves objectively. You know, I can mention 1,000 different instances. And that's what you're hearing with Rutte. Rutte is somebody who probably privately is quite confident that he and NATO, this fracturing and dying alliance, will never be challenged. And so he can say whatever he likes. That's what it boils down to. Say whatever you like. It doesn't make any difference. No one will ever challenge you. Well, I think in this case, he's probably right. The Russians don't want a war with NATO. They're not going to challenge any of it. But we have to look at the reality. And the reality is that, sure, it would take 10 years to build the kind of military power that's required to even cope with the Russians if they had to fight them. But more important, I think there's a complete failure to understand the nature of the societies in the West that he's addressing. Nobody there is interested in fighting anybody. I mean, if you called for volunteers in the Netherlands to fight in Ukraine, you know, who would show up? You know, 15 people, 10 people. It's a joke. So he's a hot air balloon. And I think that Putin knows that eventually what happens with hot air balloons, the air comes out and the balloon collapses. That's coming. May not come as fast as he would like. And certainly I wish it would happen a lot faster because I think Europe's desperately in need of new leadership. Yeah. But for the moment, you know, the hot air balloon still floats in the corner, and that's what he's doing. And he's saying stupid things. And unfortunately, you still have a lot of people, particularly, I would argue, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Scandinavia, Finland, where people still believe too much of what their government-controlled media say. It's tragic. It's this sort of culturally ingrained, well, the state says it must be right. Really? You know, I'm an American like you. I would think any reasonable Texan, if they said, well, the government says you got to do this, a reasonable Texan would say, the hell I do. I'm a Texan. I'm going to damn well do what I think is right. So you got to prove it to me. I mean, that to me is very American. That's the way I tend to think. And, you know, there's so much nonsense on the street that passes for reality. I think a lot of Americans are a little more sober-minded. But in Europe, it's a big problem in those countries. And
it really is. And I want to go, you talk about hot air balloons. Hot air balloons also love to go together because then they can have more fun and hold up things, the fiction, if you want to. So yeah. Rutte also went with Keir Starmer and met with him in 10 Downing. And he's going to talk about something here that the NATO alliance is the best military alliance in the history of the world.
We see NATO as the cornerstone of our defence, the most effective military alliance the world has ever seen, as has been proven over 80 years. And the task of the summit, obviously, is to make sure that we ensure that for decades to come, it serves exactly that same purpose. And you'll have seen our strategic defence review last week, which had a number of principles, but one of which was NATO first. So as we discussed this afternoon, our preparations for the summit, which is crucially important, I think, historic moment as we go forward in what we've called a new era for defence and security.
A new era, and the best in history. And I immediately said, hang on, Afghanistan? Was that a big NATO victory? Was what we've done in the last 3.5 years a big Ukraine victory supported by NATO? I mean, everywhere you want to look, Doug, there is tangible physical wreckage of our failures militarily. And then he wants to sit there and just repeat that canard that it's like a bumper sticker they've been talking about for years. Yeah. Do you think that there are people that think the way you and I do when they hear that, or do they just reflexively go, yeah, it's the best one in history?
I think there are more people that are in the latter camp, unfortunately, in Europe than we would like. You know, it's sort of like saying, well, I've been examined every year for the last 10 years, and they have not found any evidence for crippling disease. Therefore, I will live forever. Well, we know that's nonsense. None of us are going to live forever just because they haven't found something wrong for 10 years. Well, NATO has never really been challenged to do much of anything. And NATO was always dragged kicking and screaming, because I watched it, into things that they didn't want to be part of. I saw that with the Balkans.
Oh, yeah. I wonder if I'm sorry. I meant to actually ask you about that, because I just gave these other two examples. But how did you see NATO from the inside at the highest levels? How did you see it perform in the Balkans?
Well, first of all, there was no stomach under any circumstances for a direct military confrontation with anyone. That meant that until you had agreement from your opponent, in the case of the Balkans, it was the Yugoslav government, or the Serbs for all intents and purposes, nobody was willing to fight their way in to Kosovo or anywhere else to, quote unquote, liberate Kosovo or install anybody. There was no stomach for it. So first thing you had to do is bomb everybody for 78 days. And finally, the Serbs were told by the Russians, well, we're not going to support you. We can't. It's beyond our ability. This is back in 1999, when Russia was in very, very serious trouble. Yeah. And we also bribed them. I mean, that's another story. We promised the Russians billions of dollars. I don't know if it was ever delivered. But the point is, we sent over there during the air campaign an envoy, and he said, if you'll stop, we'll do X, Y, and Z. So ultimately, there was no fighting, because the Serbs said, well, if we can't get fuel and food during the winter, then we'll starve to death. So temporarily, we will give up Kosovo. We'll march home. We'll take our troops out. So they did. That didn't mean they renounced Kosovo, which was part of the Serbian homeland. They didn't come to any sort of conclusion like that. They simply said, we can't stay here and sustain this conflict because we won't have any food or fuel. Now, why is that important? Because that's when the Europeans expressed their willingness to send troops. In other words, we'll join the Kosovo support force. In other words, this force that would come in and establish peace and end the fighting. Well, what it really meant was that we're going to take over various sectors with Europeans and non-Europeans who have agreed to join this coalition of the willing. You've heard that before. Inside NATO, because not everybody in NATO wanted to go. I mean, if you're sitting in Spain, you look at this and say, why would I want to go there and do that?
Yeah.
If you're somewhere else, sitting in Finland or Sweden or Denmark or whatever, you may or may not want to go for different reasons. And then you had people that said, well, I'm willing to send a battalion, but I'm not sending anything else. So then you had to get larger nations to group smaller entities with their respective brigades. The Germans did that. For example, the British brought in Norwegians with them. We had a brigade and we brought in others with us. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that this thing called NATO is a facade. It's not real. And if anybody decided to challenge it, it would crack like a house of glass.
Yeah.
That's
That's my worry, but it could well be what you said a minute ago about why Mark Rutte, Keir Starmer say these things, because they don't think it will ever be challenged. So they are free to say anything if they're right. But let's almost hope that they are right, because there is a risk if they're not. And so I've talked about a lot of the Europeans and the Ukrainian leaders. Let's take a look at the Russian side of this, because they have a stake in this as well, as you might guess. There was last a week ago, last Monday, I guess, in Istanbul, the second meeting that the Russian and Ukraine side had in direct conversations, and Russia brought what they called a memo at first, which was a 12-point plan, which was, when you look at it, effectively surrender terms, because nobody would be able to agree to that on the Ukraine side, because you have to give up everything. You have to say no NATO, you have to say no denazification, you have to get rid of your military, all kinds of things in addition to the territory, etc. Withdraw from areas where you currently control willingly, etc. And so after that, that was so a week ago Monday. Then you had Peskov, and I think this was just last night. He was asked about the current situation with NATO, talking about they're going to up-arm and rearm Europe, etc., and that they're going to continue to support the Ukraine side. And he was asked in Russian media, where are you on this?
Russia abides by the agreements reached during the second round of negotiations in Istanbul and always implements them. The same cannot be said for Ukraine. We have seen and heard numerous excuses, but they are far from convincing. Russia remains committed to implementing the agreements reached in Istanbul. Hungarian Prime Minister Orbán has always been, and still is, firmly committed to solving the most difficult issues through dialogue. His position clearly stands in stark contrast to the short-sighted stance of most EU leaders. Russia and Hungary do not necessarily agree on everything. We have many differences. Nevertheless, our mutual willingness to discuss the most acute and sensitive issues at the negotiating table allows us to resolve these issues more effectively.
Now, that was yesterday by Peskov, and then I think it was the day before you had Medvedev, the former Russian president and prime minister, and he says that there's a couple things you need to understand. This is back on June 3rd. He said, our army is actively advancing and will continue to advance. Everything that must explode will certainly explode. This is in response to the attack on the Russian bomber fleet. Those who must be exterminated will disappear. The negotiations in Istanbul are needed not for a compromise peace on unrealistic conditions invented by someone, but for our speedy victory and the complete destruction of the neo-Nazi government. That is as sharp and direct a statement as you can get, that we're not interested in a negotiated settlement that leaves Kyiv in power, or the Zelensky regime in power. So, I mean, I think all that together says we'll negotiate as long as you surrender on that 12-point plan. But otherwise, it looks like they are set and are in the process of moving on until they go to Kyiv, as you said.
Well, remember, when they met in April of 2022, what the Russians were interested in were things that were far, far more reasonable than the list that you've just shown. In other words, at that time, they were looking at limited territorial acquisition, and they wanted reassurances or security assurances that there would be no NATO membership. They wanted neutrality, but it was a very different agreement from what you just saw. All right, so this is what, 3.5 years later, and what are we dealing with? Well, we're dealing with effectively what you're describing: unconditional submission to these terms, or the war continues. And what are you supposed to say? I mean, are you going to take the word of some organization that dresses up like Nazis, commits atrocities against Russian citizens in the name of Ukrainian nationalism and NATO, and a group of people sitting in West European capitals and in the United States who say, here's more money, harm Russians, kill Russians? I mean, stop and think about that. When President Trump spoke with President Putin, there was some discussion of the attack on the Tupolev bombers that damaged them. And I think President Trump conveyed the impression that he was unaware of the details of that. Well, that may or may not have been true. We know that, at least according to several sources in the media, President Trump has had roughly 14 intelligence briefings in which he actually sat there and listened since he took office. Well, that's really remarkably few. Most presidents are keenly interested in the intelligence briefing that frequently many of them got every day, sometimes 3 times a week, but certainly more than 14 times since January. So it may be that President Trump was unaware of the details, and I doubt seriously that he understood the implications under the strategic arms limitation talks. So I think President Putin listened, and he reached certain conclusions. Said, okay, let's give him the benefit of the doubt, and he didn't know. Then we're in a lot of trouble because the president doesn't know what the hell is going on. And then secondly, it's pretty clear that the president doesn't control much. He doesn't have that much influence. The people that seem to have all the influence are people like Graham and Blumenthal. So we've got a Congress that seems to be operating independently of the White House. And oh, by the way, why would the president allow these people to conduct foreign policy on behalf of the country when they are absolutely not empowered to do so? So if you're a Russian right now, you say, we can't trust anything that we are told. We can't bet on anyone holding up their quote unquote end of the deal. And so what are we going to have to do? Well, we've got to press ahead. My only concern with pressing ahead at this stage is the decisiveness involved in the ultimate outcome and the end state. What do you want this to look like when it's over? That's a question we never asked in Vietnam. We never asked it in Iraq or anywhere else. We have to ask that question, and they need to ask that question. I don't think they can live with a government in Kyiv that has anything to do with Zelensky and the people who are there. So what are they going to do about it? Because unless they're willing to go in there and root these people out, they will sit there indefinitely because people from the United States will send them money, as will people in Western Europe.